means that we are going to start recording, which means that you're going to hear our friend saying recording in progress, as you just did. With that, I'm going to be asking Darrel some questions and kind of going into some more depth about Stepmotherland. Since we're recording now, I'll just briefly reintroduce myself and Darrel. Again, my name is Malcolm Dixon, translator, Tulsa Artist Fellow, Managing Editor at Latin American Literature Today, and very happy to be in conversation with Darrel Alejandro Holnes, author of Stepmotherland, winner of the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize, and fantastic poet, playwright, and many other things besides. So, Darrel, I'd like to start with a question that seems like a sensible place to start, and that is with this collection's title. I was kind of struck by it as soon as I saw it, because I had recently, coincidentally, been working on a translation from Spanish that had to do with the concept of step families, madrastras, padrastros, hijastros, and I'm fascinated by the difficulty, I suppose, of translating that term from the Spanish to English. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you arrived at this title and why Stepmotherland.
Sure, absolutely. You know, the title for this collection originally was Tierra Madrastra, which means Tierra Madre means motherland, right? And then Madrastra is the single word for stepmother in Spanish. And so I had a conversation with a friend of mine about if I wanted a Spanish language title for a collection of poems that primarily includes English, and you know, where English has such a strong presence. And I started playing around with this word and this concept, and I couldn't find a word in English that really fit the concept. So I made up a word of my own. And so Stepmotherland is my attempt to fit this concept that I found in Spanish, you know, into the English language. Mm-hmm. And I found that process in so many ways parallels my own journey into this country, trying to take this Black Panamanian version of a human being and fitting it into a US context that, you know, doesn't always have room for someone like me. But, you know, I'm into building chairs and making sure that I get my own seat at the table. And I think that there's something magical about this title. And I think that it does that work. It builds that chair and it demands a seat at the table. I think of Stepmotherland, the concept, as something that speaks to the Pan-American reality, which is that many people on this continent might not originally be from here, right? In that their lineage connects to countries from all over the world. And I think that in a lot of ways, the project of not just the United States, but a lot of Latin American countries as well, is to try to make something new out of all of these pieces of cultures that have sort of like been left behind in a way. Like even the whole concept of post-colonial, is like these colonies, these former colonies have sort of been like left behind. And they make up this third world, which is not really actually about ranking, but it's about there being like a old world and a new world, and then the new world being the world of the colonies, right? And then this third world that then comes out of that. So that's where the term originally comes from. And I think Stepmotherland as an idea really speaks to the ways that on this continent, we struggle with inheritance, we struggle with legacy, we struggle with a history of theft, a history of slavery, a history of genocide, you know, and a history of colonization that is rooted in violence and rooted in erasure, but also gave birth to everything that we are. And so that struggle and that tension is something that I wanted to really highlight with this title, and something that tension is something that runs throughout the book and all of the poems.
Absolutely. I think it's an extremely apt title, and I definitely want to talk a little bit more about how language works in the book. I think some of what you've already said about translation is very fascinating and is kind of important to the book overall. Before I do that, and before I forget, because this is also critically important, I want to make sure that everyone is aware, thank you, Preston, for reminding me in the chat, that there are 10 free copies of Stepmotherland available at this very moment at Fulton Street Books here in Tulsa, and it's first come, first serve, as Preston mentions in the chat. So as soon as possible, get over to Fulton Street and get your free copy. Don't miss out. That being said, I think that the question of language in this book is something that really drew me to it immediately, and something that is fascinating throughout. In poems such as OTM that you read, and also Black Parade, reading the collection as a translator made me think how fantastically difficult it would be to translate a lot of these poems, because this kind of play with language is already so deeply built into them. So I suppose one way to put this question might be, do you see yourself as an English language poet, or do you think that you can even define your practice in linguistic terms like that?
Sure. You know, when I look at the etymological history of the English language, like, you find that it's also like a language of empire, and it's a language of trade. And with that, it has within it words of German origin, words of French origin, words of Arabic origin, words of, you know, that have made its way into the English language. And so I think of the language that I speak as very much a language of the new century. And it is a product of a very global education, and a product of all of the geopolitics that I've been subject to as a subject of capitalistic democracy and free trade, right? So I think of my language as the language of my experience, which so much of that is in Spanish, so much of that is on the internet, you know, so much of that is rooted in pidgin slang, which is to say that most of the slang that I grew up with in Panama is actually like a pidgin language that is, we would import words from French, like we would say buco, like beaucoup. And in OTM, there's this word fokop, which is like when you've like partied too much. And it comes from the US, you know, ideal, like being fucked up, like, dude, I got fucked up last night. But, you know, like we don't spell it F-U-C-K. And also, when I was growing up, that wasn't actually considered like a bad word, because it wasn't F-U-C-K, it's F-O-C-O-P. So it's like this version of slang in another language that we've made our own. And so I've always been really fascinated by that, because it felt like secret code, and, you know, code that I understood because I had the context for it, but it's a code that also made me feel more foreign when I engage sometimes in English in the United States, because if I do have the impulse or the draw to use any kind of slang that has its origins outside of this country, I will eventually lose someone in the audience. But I've instead found that through poetry, it's not a loss, but a gain, because when the audience stays with you through the poem, then they'll also learn something. They'll learn a new language, they'll learn a new word, they'll learn the code. And so I discovered that that poetry was also a way to teach this code, you know? And so then my knowledge of the code doesn't make me foreign, but it makes me special.
Sure, for sure. No, that's something that I loved throughout the book, was that kind of unique use of language, and like you said, going into slang in that way, and not succumbing, I suppose, to the kind of binaries that are so often accepted between, let's say, English and Spanish, or between different types of Spanish, even being willing to kind of erase those lines, right? And
Absolutely. I mean, I think more is possible than people are telling you is the truth. And everywhere that you see a boundary is a missed opportunity to connect.
Absolutely.
So don't
Absolutely.
miss that opportunity.
For sure. I think well, speaking of kind of going deep into words and kind of focusing on specific bits of language, some of the poems that I enjoy the most from your collection are the definition poems, like Baby, the poem that you read. And you mentioned in the reading that you don't read it often, and it's, like I said, one that I enjoyed a lot. So I'm interested to know, I suppose, maybe why that's one that you don't read as often, and also what attracts you to that particular form, to writing in that definition format.
Yeah, you know, at the time that I was writing the definition poems, I was reading Evan Jordan's Magnolia, and I was also reading Bird Eating Bird by Kristen Naka, which are two collections that are very, very concerned with language. Magnolia centers on the first African-American student to ever win the National Spelling Bee. And I believe it was in the 50s or the 40s, and her win was stolen from her in like a final death match, because they just refused to give her the trophy and the prize. And so that collection is very concerned with spelling and with the ways that we learn language and the power of language. And then Kristen Naka's Bird Eating Bird is about learning Spanish. And I learned from those collections how you can use the study of language to tell a story. And there were these stories that I had that I wanted to share, but I felt that they necessitated a particular vocabulary. And so if I was able to find that vocabulary, then I could tell those stories. And so I made a list of words that were keywords that kind of like were magic words that would unlock my ability to tell the story. And Baby was one of them.
Fascinating. I love those poems, especially because I think that we so often hear of poetry as being a question of giving name to certain things, right, or of defining. And so I think that that's what really drew me to these poems, in which the definition itself is the poem, you know. And it was a pleasure to hear you reading those. I also wanted to ask something that really stood out to me throughout the collection, were the ekphrastic poems. And I want to quickly here give a shout out to Liz Blood, who I believe is joining us, who is one of our fellow Tulsa Artist Fellows, and is the reason that I know the word ekphrasis. Yeah, these were poems that I particularly enjoyed, a couple of which you read, Rihanna and Child and Pietà. I'm interested to know what drew you to ekphrastic writing, and perhaps particularly that religious imagery that comes through in some of the ekphrastic poems, like the ones that you read tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think all of my friends who are sort of like lapsed Catholics or former Catholics or recovering Catholics, I mean, just like the variety, right? A lot of us continue to be like haunted by the iconography. You know, it becomes burned into you in a way, even if you are someone who doesn't believe, right? And like you get to this point where you like just have renounced your faith, but if you grow up in that culture, I think there's something really powerful about it and something really moving. And for me, there's something really global. So I will be in Bulgaria and I will see Orthodox churches everywhere. And as I tour the country, and I will go in and I will recognize a lot of the iconography, right? And I will be in Kenya and have the same experience, and I'll of course be in Panama and I'll have that experience too. And so it was a way of speaking a very global language, because I'm working with these icons that are pervasive throughout multiple cultures, and that are also that they're also like unique. Like as a Black person, I've also been really fascinated by this like cult of the Black Madonna. And also, you know, like there are these paintings that, because of time, the skin color of the figure has turned Black, and they are sometimes like venerated or worshipped by like a local community. And that's so interesting to me in a country where the Black population is so small, and consequently there's also a lot of racism and like I would experience microaggressions in a small Bulgarian village where they're also like venerating this Black Madonna. You know, like that's just fascinating to me. And so I think about what we worship and why. And so much of this book is about worship as well. The ways that we worship family, right? The ways that we worship nation state, right? The ways that we worship sex, the way that we worship each other, you know? There's I think so much about being in love is about devotion. And the paintings from the Renaissance and you know, the sculpture, the Pietà, so much of that is about devotion. And so I had to call to it in Rihanna and Child. You know, when I saw that, I recognized Madonna and Child, having grown up Catholic. And when I look at Pietà, I see an artist's devotion and commitment, you know, to making the sculpture with this kind of perfection and precision that Michelangelo is known for. And I also see the devotion of the people who are appreciating it, including like those who worship at the Church of Art and Art History, like even just the ways that it's celebrated, and that piece is seen as like a canonical is usually a word that we find more in literature, but just to like kind of import that word for a second, like it's like a canonical piece. And when you talk about art history, and so I felt like I just felt so moved when I saw it. And I could also see in it, which is why like parables work so well, is that you can also see your own stories in it. And so when I looked at the Pietà, I was also able to see my own experiences and the experiences of people in my community, right? Also in the narrative that's represented by that iconography.
Certainly.
And so it's just a place of investigation. It's like another way of investigating and asking these questions, you know, but through this artistic engagement.
For sure. I love how, just as you're saying that through an ekphrastic poem like the ones that you read, this canonical art, and perhaps it doesn't get much more canonical than Michelangelo, can become manipulable. You know what I mean? Can become almost kind of a customizable. I love how in your poem on the Pietà that you kind of paint it with different colors, right? Imagine it if it's not this kind of pure empty whiteness, but rather something else. It reminded me too of the misconception of the kind of Greek classical sculpture as being purely white, when in fact it was not. You know, that was something that came to mind. And so I think that the power dynamic perhaps between canonical art and non-canonical art, if such a division exists,
sure,
something that really impressed me in those pieces.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, in doing so, I'm also like elevating these other stories. I mean, I think the thing that's always also so fascinating to me about most of the Bible is the ways that the majority of people in the Bible are not kings and queens. And so like, what does it mean to tell their stories in a way that is supposed to be exemplary and sort of like you put them on this pedestal and like and how do you venerate them? I've also been interested in like the veneration of the mother figure, which is, from what I understand, something that makes its way into Christianity and specifically Catholicism because of cults dedicated to the veneration of the mother in the Mediterranean, particularly in Western Europe and the countries that are like now known as Italy, in that area, which is why like obviously then you get Rome and you get the Catholic Church and you get that combination, like its relationship to fertility too. And growing up in Panama, Mother's Day is actually it's the biggest sales day in the year for stores. So it's bigger than Christmas. You know, it's bigger than any other holiday because this is a country where, you know, where women are sometimes venerated and where motherhood in particular is really venerated. And so there's a lot of, I feel like my relationship to my mother is also like deeply cultural. And so if I'm writing about her, I'm writing about my culture. If I'm writing about my culture, I'm writing about my mother. In a lot of ways, you know, like because of that. So I'm excited by this. I'm excited by the opportunity that comes from these ekphrastic poems, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, as I said, they really stand out, I think, throughout the book. And perhaps just a final question would be about where the kind of sources of inspiration throughout this collection come from, because I think that they're quite diverse and wide-ranging. There are some poems that are very specifically historical. There are some that clearly are derived from a specific personal experience. There are some that are inspired by other pieces of art. So I suppose, to what extent do you see yourself as kind of a researcher or someone who is specifically seeking out questions or themes to write on? And to what extent is it just kind of coming organically through what you happen to observe? How deliberate?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think my research is very organic, you know, because I research outside of a particular project. Typically I research because I'm curious and I want to know, right? And so I think of myself as a lifelong learner. So I'm always a student of the world and a student of experience. And it's why I love to travel. It's why I love to try new things. And so much of the poems in this book come from questions. You know, the questions lead to experiences, and the experiences inspire the poems. But if I didn't nurture my curiosity, if I dismissed it, and if I was absolute about my relationship to knowledge, then I would have no creative soul. because that curiosity that every child has, I think, is the heart of any artist's creative spirit. So don't grow up too fast. Don't grow up at all, really.
Absolutely.
So, and I think that I've been able to really perfect my skills as a researcher because I've worked with ethnographers and anthropologists who trained me to conduct oral histories and historical and literary reviews, that lend to ethnographic plays and research-based plays. And that possessing that skill, it's like once you learn to ride a bike, you can't unlearn it. And so once you, I think, learn to find the answers to the questions that you have, then you'll never stop seeking more information out. So I'm constantly trying to learn more about the world, about myself, about community, about culture, about history. And that investigation created this book. And I hope to continue investigating. And I think the poems will come.
Absolutely. Well, Darrel, thank you so much for the wonderful reading and for your generosity in answering my questions. I think that we are just about out of time, so we're going to start wrapping up. But before we do, number one, I want to remind those of us who are joining us from here in Tulsa, again, to stop by Fulton Street Books. And if you're one of the first 10, then you will be receiving a free copy of Stepmotherland. So get there ASAP. And to close, I think that we are going to hear one more poem from the book. So I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming out today. And thanks again to Arthur, Preston, and to the Tulsa Artist Fellowship. I'm so excited to share this with you all today. This poem is called Poder. This poem is dedicated to the surge of Central American refugees marching to the US, who have been marching to the US for the last 20 years. Poder. The difference between poetry and rhetoric is being ready to kill yourself instead of your children, wrote Audre Lorde. I say this now to the mothers who sent their children north, risking their babies' lives for a better living than chasing paper or running from drug dealers on the streets. The difference between art and design means being ready to die for what you desire others to achieve through your work. Hours of your life gone forever, making a little shiny, fragile thing. I write to the mothers who send their children north, never knowing if they'll make it, but hoping that even if they don't, their creations might mean more than just the flesh and bone with which they're made, because they moved, because they desired. So many are quick to dismiss desire as too general a word, or this language as too simple to power the constant thrust towards betterment we call life. But poetry is sometimes made of such things. Words used so often we take them for granted and forget their power is in how they unite existence through a common tongue. In Spanish, the word for power is the same as the word for I can, poder. One simple word banging the drum rhythm made by children's souls thumping against the earth. Poder, poder, poder. The power of doing in each disyllabic step of metric feet, moving us farther and farther away from the word being just rhetoric into the structure of its design, where we find the power to turn suicide into sacrifice, the power to turn beast into man, and man into martyr or miracle. This is what makes miracles. A desire path stretching 1,700 miles through an armed border wall, through electric barbed wire fences. A surge surmounting all odds to rise beyond the stratosphere. Knowing this too is poetry.
Thank you so much, Darrel. Thank you, Preston, for doing this. Thank you to the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, as always. And with that, we'll wish you all good night. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.